Hello everyone, my name is Mallory and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I want to talk about the 7 books that I read in the month of December. Of those 7 books, 6 were romance and 1 was fantasy. December was a bit of a slower reading month for me, just because I think it always is, kind of in a way. Early December, I finished all of my final exams, and so I've spent most of December kind of just lounging around, watching a lot of TV rather than reading. And so that's why I only read like half the amount of books I usually read in a month, I think. And for a little more context, my sister and I did start watching Pretty Little Liars early December, I would say, if not late November, and we're already like partway through season 5. So that's like all I've been doing in the month of December rather than reading. So without further ado, let's talk about the 7 books that I read this month. So the first book that I read was Leather and Lark by Brynne Weaver, which is the sequel to Butcher and Blackbird. And this book follows Lachlan and Lark, and the two of them have a really disastrous first meeting, and they're kind of mean to each other because they don't realize they actually kind of inadvertently know each other, since Lachlan is Rowan's brother from the first book, and Lark is Sloane's best friend from, I think, at least college. And then Lark and Lachlan end up getting into a marriage of convenience for a pretty vague reason, in my opinion, but it's essentially to like save Lachlan's life. At least that's how Lark explains it. But eventually it does evolve into something like more real and emotional and an actual real romance, because that's kind of, it's a romance book, that's kind of how it's going to turn out. and I absolutely adored this book even more than the first one in the series. And I can be pretty picky when it comes to books, especially romance books, just because I read a lot of them, but I seriously feel like I have no bad things to say about this book. It like had all of my favorite tropes, like with the banter, enemies to lovers, marriage of convenience, slow burn, and even just like a little bit of that light comedy to balance out some of the darkness, because in my opinion this book is a little bit darker than the first book just because of some of the like trauma and backstory to both Lark and Lachlan. And then I did read this on audiobook, which I think just like was the cherry on top of how much I enjoyed this book. The next book that I read was Snowed In with the Player by Rebecca Genshak, and this book follows Holly, who is headed to her family's cabin with her best friend for their winter break, not realizing that her brother and her brother's friends are already there. And that includes Teddy, who is one of her brother's friends and teammates that she's had a crush on for a really long time. And then at some point, everyone except Holly and Teddy end up going out on a trip and then getting stuck and not being able to come back to the cabin due to a snowstorm. So they are left in that cabin with no power. And in my opinion, this was like a fine holiday book. Like, it wasn't anything special. It was short. It was like fluffy. It was fine for what it was. It did not like stand out among the books that I read this month or any other like romance books that I've read this year. The next book that I read was Set the Record Straight by Hannah Bonham Young. This book is a sapphic romance that follows Clara and Evan, who have been best friends since they were little kids. Evan has been out since she was 18 and then promptly got kicked out of her parents' house and hasn't seen them since. And then fast forward to now as adults, they end up fake dating for both their sakes. For Clara, it is because she accidentally gave off the impression that she has a girlfriend. And for Evan, it's because she wants to make her ex-fiance that she works with jealous at a work Christmas party. And personally, I loved this book. It was very like short, cute romance that I read on audio. So it was only like 4 or 5 hours just because it was such a short book. And for a novella, I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did, just because I feel like novellas, especially like romance novellas, don't always do a great job of giving enough depth to the characters and the story to really make it enjoyable. But this one I felt like was done really well for a novella. It wasn't quite a 5-star read for me, just because typically in my romance books, I like a little bit more of the like angst and drama, and this really didn't have it. It was a very low angst, fluffy romance book. Overall though, I think my favorite part of this book was how Clara was able to help Evan feel a lot more comfortable to go back to her hometown for Christmas and get over that fear of potentially running into her parents who had disowned her after coming out. The next book that I read was Lost and Lassoed by Lassoed, which is the 3rd book in the Rebel Blue Ranch series and follows Teddy and Gus. And Teddy has just lost her job at a boutique that she was working at and takes up Gus's offer to be a babysitter for his daughter over the summer. And I talked a little bit about this book in my last video where I talked about my favorite books of 2024 because I absolutely adored this book. But ever since Teddy and Gus were introduced in Done and Dusted, I have been counting down the days until I could read this book because I absolutely loved their banter and their back and forth from the start. I just knew that their book was going to be one of my favorites, and it absolutely delivered on that promise. Like I said, the banter and the back and forth was absolutely perfect, and I really felt like I could see myself in both of those characters, as both of them are the oldest siblings in their family, and the struggle of trying to balance being a sibling and also feeling like you have a ton of responsibilities and almost feeling like a third parent sometimes. I definitely could relate to that as well. The next book that I read was Wild Eyes by Elsie Silver, which is the sequel to Wild Love and part of the Rose Hill series. And so this book follows Skylar, who is a famous country singer and escapes to Rose Hill after her life kind of blows up when she realizes that pretty much everything in her life from a very young age has been fabricated by her father and just made up and not real. Even her relationship that she thought she was in was not real and invented by her father and her record label. And so like I said, she escapes that life and heads to Rose Hill, where she hopes to then write her own album for the first time, because even her music has never been written by her. She's not a songwriter in her own opinion. She then meets West because she attempted to get a video of a grizzly bear and nearly dies, and he saves her from that, and then in turn ends up neighbors because she ends up staying in the bunkhouse next door to West's house. And following kind of a theme of enjoying the sequel more than the rest of the books in the series, I loved this book even more than Wild Love. I liked Wild Love because it was very sweet and like a childhood friends to lovers romance, but this was very much a like enemies to lovers, I guess, in a sense. Not quite. It was just very like angsty and a lot of banter. Can you tell I really like banter in romance books? It seems to be a common theme here. But I think the reason I loved this book so much is because it was more than just about the romance. As much as I did love the romance, obviously, and there was quite a bit, it really did also delve into Skylar trying to figure out who she actually is behind the camera and when she's not performing and when she is just able to be herself. She never really knew who she was because, like I've said a million times, her father kind of crafted an image of who she was supposed to be from a very young age, and so she never felt like she got to explore who she really was. And I think one of my favorite parts of this book was how Wes would email her headlines about just random things that were happening in her day-to-day life that were true, so that she would stop reading the headlines that news articles were writing about her because most of them weren't true. So the next book that I read was Carry On by Rainbow Rowell, and this is actually a reread for me. So this book follows Simon Snow, who is the chosen one, even if he doesn't really want to be or feels like he is. And Baz is his roommate, who may or may not be a vampire. And honestly, I really don't know how to describe the plot of this book because it's so much because so much of it really is just vibes. If you read it, or even just read the summary that you find on Storygraph or the back of the book, it really is just Harry and Draco fanfiction. That's really what it is. That was the inspiration for this book. But I still ate it up and I absolutely loved this book. And like I said, it was a reread for me and I loved every single second of it. I listened to it on audiobook, which I think helped because I honestly forgot until I listened to the audiobook that it's supposed to be set in the UK and these characters are British. And so the audiobook definitely helped with that as well. And Simon and Baz's dynamic was everything I remembered. It was very funny and heartwarming and just a bit chaotic. My only complaint about it though was just that it felt like it dragged on a little bit and the ending was a little dragged out more than it needed to be, in my opinion. But still, it was a very fun reread and I do want to continue with the series. The reason I reread this one was because I never ended up reading the third book, but I remembered nothing that happened in the first two books. So hopefully in the new year, I will finish up this reread and finish the series. And then the last book that I finished this month was Keep Me by Sarah Kate. And Keep Me is a marriage of convenience that follows Sylvie and Killian. And Sylvie agrees to a marriage of convenience with Killian so that she can earn $10 million because her parents just cut her off from her trust and all of her funds, so she really needs some money. He agrees to the marriage because he thinks that it will improve his reputation a bit and keep his relatives off his back about the fact that he never really leaves the house because his parents died and left the manor in his name and he just never leaves the house ever. However, Sylvie's plan is a little bit more deceptive than Killian realizes, and if anybody knows how much I love Sarah Kate books, this should not come as a surprise as to how much I loved this book. I honestly wasn't sure that I was going to give it as high of a rating as I did just because I felt like I was a little bit slower reading it, but I think that was probably just because it was on audiobook and the audiobook wasn't my favorite. Like, I didn't love the narrators, but regardless, I love marriage of convenience romances. You know, I loved the banter and the back and forth and everything that eventually turned into very like emotional like scenes and them really caring for each other, and Sylvia especially really growing as a character from being a very like, not that I felt like she was selfish, but that's kind of how she was portrayed, even though in my opinion she was very right to act the way she acted because of how her parents treated her growing up. But yeah, just very much character growth between both of them, but especially Sylvie in my opinion, and I'm very excited to see how the rest of the series goes. And like I said, that is all of the books that I read this month, but there is one book that I'm currently in the middle of reading that I was hoping to have finished by the time I filmed this video, and it just did not happen. And that is the Pretty Little Liars book that the TV show is based on. And I just was very inspired to read it because, like I mentioned at the beginning, my sister and I are rewatching Pretty Little Liars, and I've just always been intrigued by the books because there's like 16 books in the series, and I've heard they end up being quite different than the TV show, so I'm curious to see how they go. But I'm only like probably 40% done with the first book, so I do not think it was going to be finished by the time I filmed this video. I hope I will finish it by the end of the month, but we shall see. And so far I'm like enjoying it in the sense that like it's very entertaining and I can appreciate why people really loved it. But you know, having seen the TV show, it is quite a bit different, and you can definitely tell that it was written in the early 2000s because of the writing style and some of the like language choices and stuff like that. But it's very entertaining, and I'm excited to finish it and hopefully continue with the rest of the series. And so that is it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time with a new one.